Tonight, since we've been doing kind of 1 week series as we're winding down our Wednesday night Bible classes, tonight I wanted to look at the history of Christmas to see where we get some of our Christmas traditions. Maybe you don't realize why you do what you do around the house if you do celebrate Christmas, and then kind of contrast the commonalities of Christmas against what the Bible tells us about the birth of Jesus. And so I thought this would be an interesting study depending on what time of year it is. And so just a few facts as we begin. Each year, 30 to 35 million real Christmas trees are sold in the United States alone. There are 21,000 Christmas tree growers in the United States. The Christmas trees themselves have to grow for about 15 years before they can be harvested and used. And there is a Christmas tree farm in every single state of the United States, including Hawaii. The first Christmas trees were explicitly decorated and named after the Christian holiday. They appeared in Strasbourg, Germany in the 17th century. So in the 1600s is when people started to decorate Christmas trees. So in the scheme of Christmas traditions, it's actually pretty recent. The first Christmas trees that we know of that were celebrated in the United States was in the 1820s by German immigrants. And so 1820s was the first Christmas trees being used. The Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, they set Christmas about 2 weeks behind December the 25th. So not everybody celebrates Christmas on Christmas. In the Middle Ages, Christmas was celebrated by rowdy and raucous parties, and it was more like what we would consider Mardi Gras down in New Orleans than the Christmas holidays that you and I would expect today. Actually, from 1659 to 1681, Christmas was actually outlawed in Boston, and anybody breaking the law was fined 15 shillings. And so the Puritans thought Christmas created this air of debauchery, so they actually outlawed it in Boston for a couple of years. Christmas was first declared a federal holiday in 1870, so even after Thanksgiving. The first eggnog in the United States was made in 1607 at Jamestown by Captain John Smith. If you've ever watched Pocahontas, you've probably seen John Smith in the animation. Or not him personally, but his character. Poinsettia plants are from Mexico, and they're named after Joel R. Poinsett, who was an American minister to Mexico who brought the plant to America in 1828. I don't know why it's got its association with Christmas, but that's where we get the poinsettias from. Rudolph, the most famous reindeer of all, was actually a product of Robert May's imagination in 1939 about a poem that he wrote to try to get customers inside the Montgomery Ward department store. And so it was a marketing ploy. Construction workers were actually the first ones to bring a Christmas tree into the Rockefeller Center in 1931 when they were on a building project, and that started to happen each and every year. And I believe in 1939 was the first official Rockefeller Christmas tree that was actually put on there by the Rockefellers. The reason that you have Christmas trees today is because of a German prince. Prince Albert of Germany married Victoria of England. He brought the German tradition of decorating Christmas trees with him to the royal family. And in 1848, a picture of him and the royal family in front of their 40-foot Christmas tree began to circulate in the United States. And so that's when Christmas trees started to become popular in the U.S. And so the art of decorating Christmas trees in the United States has only been around for about 120 years in grand fashion, or universally. Santa was depicted in all types of colors and clothings, but in 1930s, Coca-Cola had an advertisement campaign that depicted the more plump, jolly Santa Claus in a red suit, and that just took off because Coca-Cola is just that good. And so they pretty much invented the image of what you think about to be Santa Claus. Celtic peoples considered mistletoe to have magic powers. It was said to have the ability to heal wounds and increase fertility. And so the Celtics would actually hang mistletoe in their homes to ward off evil spirits. And so if you've ever wondered why we hang mistletoe and kiss underneath it, it's because the Celtics thought it increased fertility. So there you go. Does anybody hang stockings in their home? Does anybody know why you hang stockings? Get presents? Okay, all right. Does anybody know the history behind why we hang stockings? I had no idea until I was doing this. Dry your socks? Well, I mean, like on Christmas Eve, why do you hang, stockings? You may hang stockings. I don't wear stockings, so I don't know, but the legend of St. Nicholas, one of the legends is that there were 3 poor sisters who could not marry because they didn't have any money for a dowry. Well, St. Nick sent each of the 3 sisters a gold coin. One went down the chimney, which is where we get St. Nick coming down the chimney, and one landed in one of the stockings that was on the hearth by the fireplace, which I guess drying out. So, Mark, you're not the only one. And so another went into a pair of shoes. So if you go to the Netherlands, they actually put shoes on the mantle instead of putting stockings up. But that came from the legend of St. Nicholas and his gold coins. I don't put stockings up, but if gold coins are in there, I might start. And the USPS handles about 15.8 billion pieces of mail from Thanksgiving to Christmas Eve, not including UPS or FedEx. So a lot of mail gets distributed throughout the United States. Some interesting things about the pre-Christian traditions and how they got incorporated into the Christian holiday of Christmas. In Scandinavia, you have the Yule log that was burned on the winter solstice. Each ember that came off the Yule log was supposed to be significant and supposed to be a symbolism of each calf that was going to be born in the upcoming year. And so the Yuletide carols that you hear about in some of the carols of Christmas come from this European tradition. Also throughout Europe, light was an extremely important part of the winter solstice because it was the darkest time of year. And so lights were extremely important, and that also got incorporated into the Christmas season. In Scandinavia, you've got the Yule log. In Germany, the German people honored the pagan god Odin, and during the winter holidays, they were terrified of Odin because he was believed to make nocturnal flights, and he would decide who would get to prosper and who would get to perish. And so in Germany, a lot of people wouldn't like to go outside because Odin might see him as he rode through the air, which I don't know about you, but to me kind of sounds like Santa Claus and his naughty and nice list. Interestingly, some of the Christmas traditions that we get from Rome, Saturnella was the god of light, the god of agriculture, and he was celebrated. And beginning in the week leading up to the winter solstice, they had hedonistic time with food and drink. Social order was turned upside down. Peasants would often go to the richest people of the cities and demand gifts and presents. Also around this time was the Roman celebration of Juvenilla, which was a feast celebrating children. Also there was the Iranian god Mithra, which was an infant god, and he was the god of the sun, and he was celebrated on December the 25th, and they would give presents, and for most Romans this was the most sacred day of the year. It's interesting to see how if you combine the Saturnella, Juvenilla, and Mithra, you've kind of got the overlay of, you could see why the early Christian church decided to take these things, kind of shift them around a little bit, put a new name on it, and that was their ploy to try to get pagans into the early years of Christianity. Easter was the main holiday, which focused on Jesus' death and his resurrection. The first 4 centuries of the church, there is no indication whatsoever that Jesus' birth was ever celebrated in any fashion. The Bible does not mention the date of his birth. Puritans would use this as a means to debunk Christmas and not celebrate it centuries later. The Bishop of Rome, Julius I, chose December the 25th as Jesus' birth, most likely because of his relation to Mithra. One of the ways that the Catholic Church tried to get pagans to convert early on was taking things in their pagan traditions and trying to incorporate them into Christianity. Just recently, we had a missionary come to us from Peru. Does anybody remember his name for brownie points? Ryan Davis. Ryan Davis showed a picture of people dancing in traditional Mesoamerican garb in front of something. What was it? Anybody remember what it was? They were dancing in front of a saint. Do you remember what the saint was? It was a mountain. Y'all remember now? You remember the people danced from the mountain? And it was a saint in the Catholic Church. Why? Because they came through there, these people worshiped the mountain, and they had such a hard time getting these people to leave their foreign religion, they said, well, never mind. We'll just make the mountain a saint if you convert. And they were like, okay. And so they still have celebrations even today in Cusco, Peru, where they go and celebrate the saint, which is a mountain. And so they kind of did the same thing. They took their traditions and said, you know what, we'll put a Christian name on there, we'll dress them up a little bit, and that's what we'll do. And so, but by the 5th century, it had spread to Egypt, and by the 6th century, it had gone to England, and by the 8th century, it had reached all the way to parts of what we think of Russia and Scandinavia. Let's see here. Okay. All right, and so to move on a little bit, the poor demanded to be fed. I mean, freedom probably wasn't bad for a slave either, but they demanded to be fed and paid by the rich. Puritans were not a fan. Christmas before the 1800s was more a time of revelry. It was more of a time for drink, for sin, sensuality, displays of, it was not what we think about today as peace and good tidings to all mankind. And so Christmas was actually banned. When Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans took over England in 1645, they actually outlawed Christmas. And they had control of England there for several years until Charles II was reinstated by pro-Catholic forces. And so when that took place, Christmas was reinstated, but the Puritans never lost their disdain for Christmas because, as I said before, Christmas was not how you and I think of Christmas. It was a time like we would consider Mardi Gras. And so when the Pilgrims came to the United States, when they were seeking religious freedom, that was one of the first things they did was ban Christmas. Christmas was not celebrated in early America, and as I mentioned before, from 1659 to 1681, anyone caught celebrating Christmas in Boston was fined 5 shillings. And then Christmas was kind of reinvented. Two things that reinvented Christmas took place. In 1819, one of the best-selling authors at that time wrote a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And he reinvented Christmas as a way of peace and good tidings towards man. And in that story, he talks about a poor man who goes to a house and he's given a warm meal and he's given tried to break down the social barriers from the rich and the poor. And then the one that you're most familiar with is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which was about charity. Does anybody know kind of the big moment in A Christmas Carol? Towards the end. It's Ebenezer Scrooge, right? But what happens there towards the end? You can use the Muppets as a reference, right? That's what I do. Remember, Ebenezer Scrooge finally wakes up. He realizes because of the 3 ghosts that he's lived an awful life. So he's cheerful, he's merry. He goes to, whose house does he go to celebrate Christmas at?
Tiny Tim.
Right? It's like, his name's Crutcher or something, right? But he goes in there and Tiny Tim's there, right? And Tiny Tim, right? It's like Merry Christmas to all of us, right? And so this idea that this rich guy, Ebenezer Scrooge, can go to the house of a peasant that works for him and enjoy Christmas. And Tiny Tim says, Merry Christmas to all of us. It's a holiday for everybody. And so with these 2 popular writings, Christmas was reinvented as a time of like goodwill, the exchanging of gifts, this time of peace and unity between social classes. That's something we can all get behind, and that is the celebration of Christmas. And so Americans really took the idea of these 2 to heart. They drew traditions from especially the Germans that have always been kind of big on Christmas, but a few other places, and kind of formulated their own Christmas traditions. The Christmas tree came from Germany. The sending of Christmas cards came from England. And so we kind of took this hodgepodge of different Christmas things and blended them all together. But what about Jesus' birth? When we look at what the biblical aspects tell us about the birth of Christ versus what is often portrayed in popular culture with the birth of Jesus and Christmas, there are a few things that I think are actually interesting when we start to look at that. And the first thing is the year. When was Jesus born? Somebody give me a year. Don't look at the slides. Well, naturally, you would think 0. Right? I mean, you got BC, which means what? Before Christ, right? You've got AD, which means, right? In Latin, which means year of our Lord, right? So pretty standard, right? Jesus was born at 0. Well, Not so fast, right? Okay. Herod died in 4 BC. Why is that important to us? Why is it important to us that Herod died in 4 BC? When trying to determine the birth year of Jesus.
That's the same Herod that sought to kill him?
Yeah, it's the same Herod that we're told in the biblical narrative that killed all the infants 2 years under in Bethlehem, right? And so if he dies in 4 BC, I mean, Jesus couldn't have been born at 0, right? Because the biblical narrative plainly states that Herod was living when he told everyone, or told the soldiers to kill the infants in Bethlehem. So it could have been in 4 BC. Also, we're told the reason why Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem. Did Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem? No. Why were they there? The census, right? The census of Quirinius, right? We know that he was the governor of Syria, right? Which at that time, that's what Jerusalem would have been inside the Roman province of Syria. So he gives the census in 6 BC. And so here we see here that monk Dionysius, he was actually the one who prepared what we think today is a modern calendar. That wasn't prepared until when? You can use a slide for this one. All right, 525. And so you've got a monk who's commissioned by the Pope in 525 to make a calendar, right? The Pope wants a new calendar. He doesn't want to count years anymore in different places by different numbers, by the numbers of how long the king has reigned. He wants one universal calendar for the Christian world, and he wants the focal point of that calendar to be the birth of Christ. And so he gives a monk the task of tracing the time all the way back to Jesus, 525 years roughly after Jesus was even born. Can you imagine how hard of a task that was? And the dude got it wrong by 5 or 6 years, which I think is incredible. I mean, that's impressive that that monk was able to do that. But Jesus was most likely born in 6 to 5 BC, sometime in between the census, the commissioned census of Quirinius, and the death of Herod. So there's a congregation that's near and dear to me, but one of their cornerstones of their congregation says established in AD 33, which I understand why you would put that, right? Because, you know, the Gospels tell us that Jesus was about 30 years when he began his ministry. His ministry was about 3 years old, so it means he died when he was 33. If he was born at 0, at AD 33, the church was established, right? It's good. There's a problem. If we'd be more accurate, it should probably say established AD 27, right? I'm not saying we should go and change the cornerstones on our church buildings. I'm saying it is kind of interesting to see here that Jesus was actually born in 5 or 6 BC instead of 0 AD. Anybody have any questions or comments on the date of Jesus' birth? Anybody find that interesting? Yeah, I think it's kind of neat, kind of interesting. All right, so we've talked about the year. So what about the date? Let's see. So the date for Christmas falls on what? December the 25th, right? That's the date that was established by the Bishop of Rome. I believe it was Julius, but I can't remember. And so I would suggest to you that he probably picked that because of the celebrations for the god Mithra. And they were trying to get people to convert to Christianity and decided, you know what, let's just pick Jesus' birth on December 25th. I mean, they already have a celebration to their God, the infant God that was, you know, born on December 25th. Let's just take it, right? Let's just have bigger parties, better presents, and let's get people to sign up, right? So, getting people into the church today with like gifts and appeasing to their natural side is not new. Okay, that's not a recent invention. People have been doing that for years, trying to get people in the door by various means. And so what they did was try to take the worship to the god Mithra and move it in. But what about the biblical date? Well, the Bible tells us that the shepherds were out into the fields during that time. And we know from history, from archaeology, and also from ancient writings that it was customary for the Jews to send out the sheep to the deserts about the Passover, which was early spring, and to bring them in at the commencement of the first rains, which began sometime in the mid-fall. And so Jesus was most likely born sometime between spring, so April, March, April-ish, all the way to mid-fall, which would have been September. So Jesus' birth probably falls sometime in there. And so shepherds wouldn't have been out with the sheep during the wintertime. It almost certainly wasn't in the winter. And so that's the date. Anybody have any questions or comments on the date of Jesus' birth? It's probably the right response because there's not much we can really say. The Bible doesn't really tell us. It's also interesting that, as we mentioned before, for the first 400 years of the church's, 300 years of the church's existence, wasn't really a big deal. Nobody really cared because the important date was the Passover, which was interesting. Unlike Jesus' birth, did they know when Jesus died? Yeah, because the Passover was celebrated the same day every year, right? So they knew when the Passover was. And so the whole Easter celebration is more in tune with the time when Jesus died, whereas his birth, it's really a toss-up. We don't know, but most likely not even close to December the 25th. So what about the Magi? You've all seen the Little Drummer Boy, the clanimation thing from the 60s, right? You've got the three kings that come to Jesus and they lay the gifts at his feet. But that's not what the Bible tells us. These Magi were wise men. We have no idea how many came to Jesus. It could have been 3. It could have been 300 for all we know. But one thing we do know is that they were not royalty. The Eastern Church celebrates Three Kings Day, which is in celebration of the 3 kings that came to Jesus. Well, if they were Magi, they were not royalty. They were political advisors to Eastern kings, but there wasn't a drop of blue blood in them. And so it's interesting here how these guys have been narrowed down to 3 as a representation of the 3 gifts that they brought, and also been elevated to the side of kings. Where would these Magi have come from? The East. Did anybody have inclination? How do they know to come? The stars, right? What else? They also make an allusion to the Scriptures, right? The Scriptures tell us this is why we came. Okay? Were these Jews? Were they Gentiles? They were living in the East. Growing up as a kid, I always assumed they were Gentiles because that's just kind of how it was portrayed in the Clay video that I saw as a kid with a Little Drummer Boy, right? But that's probably not what took place. Does anybody know of a reason when Jews were sent off to the East? Right? Babylon, right? When the temple was destroyed, 586, they're carried off into Babylonian captivity. Then the Persians come. Then we get the biblical stories of men like Ezra and Nehemiah that came back and rebuilt the wall and rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the city, and the Jews come back. But most of the Jews at that time didn't leave Babylon. They actually stayed. And so there was a large Jewish population that stayed in Babylon. In fact, we have one of the most significant pieces of ancient literature that we have in the study of Judaism is the Babylonian Talmud, which is basically the reconstruction of their Bible and their teachings that we have from Babylon. And so these men were probably political advisors over in the Persian province who were Jews. Who had kept the old law, who were reading the Bible. They were searching for the Messiah just as much as the Jews in Palestine were. And they were able to see from studying the Scriptures that the Messiah had come, and they had seen the star. And so I think it's interesting that these guys were most likely the descendants of Jewish people that were taken off into Babylonian captivity, and that's why they were studying the Scriptures. That's why they saw the star. That's why they made the trek to find the Messiah. That's because they were Jews living in the province of Persia. These were not birthday gifts. When they visited Christ, he was not in a manger, but he was in a house, and he was a small child and not an infant. If you look at your text there, when you see when the Magi or the wise men get there, Jesus is not called a baby or an infant, but he's actually called a small child. And you may say, well, what's the difference? Well, I guess it's on who you ask. But the interesting thing is, in Greek, they're different words. And so here, when Jesus is referred to as a small child, he's referred to as a paideia. If you look at the biblical narratives in Matthew, in Luke 2:12 and also Luke 2:16, talking about when he was born, being in a manger, the Greek word there is used is briphos, which means infant. There was another Greek word, napios, which is also used for infant. That word's not used for Jesus, but brephos is, which means literally like a newborn child. But when the Magi get to Jesus, he is a paideia, which makes sense because when Herod goes and tries to kill the babies in Bethlehem, who is he trying to kill? What age? 2 and under, right? We don't even know that Jesus is even in Bethlehem at the time that he kills all the babies in Bethlehem, because all he knew was that the Messiah had been born in Bethlehem, but that's not even where Jesus' family was from, right? And so he may have been killing the babies in Bethlehem because he'd just been told that's where the Messiah was born when Jesus wasn't even in the city. And so that's quite interesting. Also, the 3 gifts that are given, gold and frankincense, is an indication of royalty. And it's interesting that that's taken from Isaiah chapter 60, verses 3 and 6. But myrrh is a very strong odor that's used in burials. And so they were probably looking at Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 through 27, indicating that this was going to be the Messiah that was going to die. Isaiah chapter 53 type stuff. In fact, myrrh is used in John 19:39 when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus prepared the Lord's body for burial. And so the interesting thing is as these magi went to Jesus and gave him these gifts, they give him 2 gifts signifying royalty, and they also give him a gift signifying death, which kind of shows that biblical theme that you see throughout Jesus' ministry, that he was born to die. And I think it's kind of interesting here that you have this scene of where the celebration that the Messiah has been born, and these magi are already bringing a gift symbolizing his death. Kind of interesting. And then, of course, you mirror that when Jesus says that, for this purpose, he came into the world was to die. Any questions or comments on the magi, the wise men? Okay. We can talk about all the different details between Jesus' birth, where it was, when it was, what date it was, all those things. But the important thing is not the details of his birth, but the purpose behind his birth. And so many times people get caught up in the details. When was Jesus born? How many magi there was? And start all kinds of arguments about, this, that, and the other. Should we celebrate Christmas? Should we not? All these things. When the main purpose behind Jesus' birth was that the Messiah, God in the flesh, pitched his tent with us, John chapter 1, that he lived in the flesh, that he was born to die, and that he died so that you and I might live. And that's the main reason behind Christ's birth. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far on our lesson tonight on the traditions of Christmas?
Did you say it was in a house? Is that later when they got there? Or
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons as to why the text kind of indicates that he was an infant, especially with the changing of the nouns as to the age of him. Instead of using either napios or brephos, they use paideia. So I think that also coupled with the idea that he's not in the manger anymore, he's not there, that it probably would have been later. It wouldn't have been, you've seen the videos where the Magi get there the night he's born, and Mary's got him in swaddling clothes and he's in a manger and the kings come in and they lay the stuff at his feet and he's 7 minutes old, and the biblical text just doesn't tell us that. At least doesn't point to that type of imagery. So yes, I think the idea that says that he's in a house, and also the word there for small child, is a good indication of that. So great question.
Isaac, I feel like growing up in the Church of Christ, we were almost, Christmas is not Jesus' birthday.
Right.
We celebrate it. As I've gotten older, it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
I look at it now as, at least on that day, at least people are thinking about Jesus.
Yeah.
Where, I guess growing up in the Church of Christ, no, you can't do that. That's denominationalism or whatever.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I mean, as a 40-something-year-old, it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
I don't teach that to my kids. Is that, hey, we don't believe Jesus born on Christmas. I mean,
right.
The nativity scenes. And, I might offend some people in here by saying that the nativity scenes don't bother me. I mean,
right.
you know, I mean, I know growing up, no, we can't have a nativity scene. Well, why not? You know,
Yeah.
But
No, it's interesting. I mean, you know, you can't sing Joy to the World unless it's July the 1st, you know, like that type of stuff. Now, there's a fine line, and I understand. I think you're right. I think we can go a wrong direction. I think we can be too hardcore. I understand why. We don't want to give an air to false teaching or put our step behind that. But at the same time, our job as Christians is to start conversations. And so we should instruct our kids that Jesus probably wasn't born December 25th, you know, and all the things we've talked about tonight. In order not that they can go to school, or not that we can talk to our coworkers at work and say, you guys are just dumb. You know, y'all don't even know. Let me tell you X, Y, and Z why this Jesus wasn't born on Christmas. But we should be looking to start conversations, right? And say, well, have you ever read in the Bible where it talks about, you know, Jesus being a small child, not a baby? Have you ever thought about it? No, I ain't thought about that. You know, or isn't it kind of cool how the gold, frankincense, and myrrh indicate his royalty, but also his death? Like he was born to die. Like Jesus, it's amazing to me that Jesus wasn't born to set up an earthly kingdom with the Jews that failed. He's got to come back in the rapture set up. It's amazing to me at his birth that they're already indicating he's going to die. Isn't that kind of interesting? Well, I never thought about that. Like instead of saying, you know, beating people over the head and saying, you guys don't know your Bible, maybe we should try to start conversations and saying, hey, you ever thought about this? And maybe we can work in some other stuff and get them thinking about stuff like that.
But one other thing, and we don't do it here at Chapel Hill, but I've got friends all over that go to the Church of Christ. And their Church of Christ lets out, you know, on a Wednesday night or, you know, or a Sunday night, where the rest of the world, or the denominational world, that's when they make sure they come together. And I've always thought that was,
Yeah.
I don't know, a little crazy.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it's that the tradition of like the Christmas Mass, which is really what we get the word Christmas, right? Which is Christ Mass, which is, you know, the Catholic Church to have this big Mass on Christmas, and that was, like you were saying, one of the big days, you know, Christmas and Easter, and so that's kind of like that. Why you see that, right? And I can understand the goal of trying to distance ourselves from false teaching, but I do think sometimes we can go too hardcore, too far, and miss an opportunity to start those conversations, like you were saying, and get people thinking about, well, have you ever thought about this? And if we can say, no, the Bible clearly says that this tradition that most of the Christian world has bought into isn't what the Bible actually says, that might open up another conversation for other traditions that the Christian world has bought into that's not biblically based, that we can use almost as a tool instead of just burying our heads in the sand, not saying anything, like you were saying. So I think those are great comments, absolutely.
When they really started with idols, when is Christmas, did the Catholics bring it in? I mean, Christ,
Yeah.
the Catholics do that before that.
Yeah, the church in Rome started about the mid-300s. It wasn't widespread until much later. It started being celebrated as a Christian holiday in Rome in the 330s on a very small scale. It had spread to other parts. Like we said, it went to Egypt in the 5th century. It had gone as far as Russia and Scandinavia in the 8th century. But as far as like full-blown Christian world, everybody celebrating Christmas, probably wasn't until the Middle Ages. So probably not till like 1,200 years after the church was established did you really start seeing it celebrated throughout the Christian world at that time. And to be honest, it was used by the Catholic Church by and large to try to get pagans into Christianity. And it was an appeasement of, you can keep your traditions. You can still come together on December 25th, eat, drink, and give gifts. Just, we're not celebrating the infant gun Mithra, we're celebrating the infant God Jesus. Like, just change the name. And that was the motivation behind it, is trying to let them keep as much of their tradition as possible while using other stuff. You know, Odin, you know, he goes through the night, you know, giving, you know, good things and bad things. That's fine. We'll just change it around a little bit. You know, you guys use lights everywhere to symbolize blessings. That's cool. We'll throw that in too. Like, we'll just mix all around, start our own thing. And I mean, if you tell people you're going to give them gifts and food, you know, it's like, you know, if you invite me to your house and say, Isaac, there's going to be food and gifts, I'll probably come, you know. And so that's just kind of what they did, you know, trying to get people to do that. So,
The most confusing thing I've seen thus far, though, is Happy Birthday, Santa Claus.
happy birthday, Santa Claus.
I saw that in,
Oh, really? That person's just all kinds of confused, huh? Mercy. So that is interesting. So I don't even know where you'd start that person. You have to like teach them error so they get that straight. Then you got to teach them why it's wrong. So great comments. Thank you so much for all your questions. Anybody have any other questions or comments? I just want to appreciate. I appreciate y'all stretching that out for about 13 more minutes. So that helped me out greatly. If there are no other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and end with a prayer. Dear God, we're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come together tonight and to study your word. We're so thankful for the fellowship of Christian brothers and sisters. Dear Heavenly Father, we're most thankful for your Son. We're so thankful for his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, and the work that he still now does as our intermediary, our intercessor, and our high priest. We're so thankful for celebration, but most importantly, the celebration of your love for us. And we hope to celebrate that each and every day that we live, in the way that we love you and the way we love each other. Please help us to have conversations with those who are outside of Christ, those who have been taught things that are non-biblical, not in a way that is haughty, but in a way that is humble, and a way that seeks to show them the truth of your word. Dear Heavenly Father, please be with us and help us to be bold servants in your kingdom. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.